Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking a crucial step into the world of pediatric interventions. When we look at essential procedures, medications, IV therapy, nutritional support, the margins for error in children are they're razor thin. Their bodies respond so differently, which means standard adult protocols. They simply don't apply.
That's precisely why this deep dive is so vital. Our mission today is really to synthesize the foundational knowledge for these high-stakes procedures, drawing directly from essential pediatric nursing guidelines.
Right.
We need to focus on how to provide not just safe and effective care, but crucially atraumatic care.
Atraumatic, yeah.
And the starting point has to be this critical realization.
Yeah.
Children are not just miniature adults. Their unique physiology, their developmental stage, their pharmacology.
Right.
It all demands a completely specialized approach.
Okay, let's unpack this, though. We've got three pretty complex areas to cover today. First up, medication administration. We'll dive into the science of how kids process drugs, thinking about pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. Second, IV therapy. Mastering fluid calculation, sites, safety, all that. And finally, nutritional support. Breaking down everything from tube feeds, enteral nutrition, to the really high concentration IV feeding, Total Parenteral Nutrition, or TPN, and understanding those safety checks, like checking the gastric residual.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, let's jump straight into medication administration. We all know the basic 6 rights, but the source material is really clear that in pediatrics, there's kind of an overarching 7th right, the right approach.
Yeah, that right approach is exactly where technical skill meets developmental care. It's fundamental. It basically means you have to provide explanations that are age-appropriate, you have to consider where the child is developmentally. It's the only way to minimize that psychological distress.
And even standard safety stuff gets tricky, right? Like the National Patient Safety Goals require 2 identifiers.
Absolutely. But what happens when, the 4-year-old yanks off their ID bracelet? Or the 6-year-old insists they're someone else because they know a shot is coming?
Oh yeah, been there.
You have to be hyper-vigilant. You constantly have to verify that identity with the caregiver. It's non-negotiable.
And that ties right into atraumatic care, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's not just about pain, it's about trust. I thought that research bit was fascinating about injection position. Kids reporting less pain and fear when they were sitting versus lying down for a shot.
It's such a simple change, isn't it? But that, combined with things like therapeutic hugging, where a parent holds them securely, or using distraction like music or bubbles, it just changes the whole experience for them.
Reduces that feeling of helplessness.
Exactly. It gives them some measure of control back.
Now, let's talk about the why. The biology behind why pediatric dosing is such a headache. This is where pharmacology comes in. Can you remind us of the difference between those 2 key concepts?
Sure. So first you have pharmacodynamics. That's basically what does the drug actually do to the body, at the cellular level. And then you have pharmacokinetics. That's the flip side. What does the body do to the drug?
How it moves through.
Right. Absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion, ADME.
And it's the kinetics, the ADME part, that's dramatically different in kids because their systems are still maturing. So what are the key physiological differences we need to watch out for?
Okay, let's start with absorption. Orally, kids often have slower gastric emptying and a higher gastric pH. So that affects how quickly oral meds start working. But maybe the most counterintuitive one, topical absorption.
Topical.
Like creams. Exactly. Because children have a greater body surface area relative to their weight and their skin is more permeable, they have significantly increased topical absorption.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying we could see systemic side effects from just a medicated cream? That seems like something that could easily be missed.
It absolutely can. What might be a totally safe topical dose for an adult could potentially lead to systemic toxicity in a baby or a very young child. It's a huge difference. Then, moving to distribution. Kids have a higher percentage of body water, less body fat. That changes where drugs actually go in the body. And critically, they have less plasma protein for drugs to bind to and an immature blood-brain barrier, especially in neonates.
Meaning drugs can cross into the brain more easily.
Potentially, yes. Some drugs can access the central nervous system much more readily than in adults.
Wow. Okay, and that leads us to the final stages, metabolism and excretion, which sound like they're high risk too.
They really are. Hepatic enzyme production, so liver function, is immature. And kidney function doesn't fully mature until maybe 1 to 2 years old. The clinical impact of all this. a significantly longer drug half-life.
So the drug hangs around longer.
Exactly. It lingers in the system, which increases the potential for accumulation and, well, toxicity. That's why the dosage calculation has to be absolutely meticulous.
Speaking of meticulous,
Yeah.
the two main methods are body weight dosing, that's mg/kg a day or mg/kd days, and we really need to know the difference.
Yes, crucial distinction.
And body surface area, or BSA. That's often for things like chemotherapy, right?
That's right. The BSA method uses a nomogram, factoring in height and weight. But body weight is much more common for everyday meds. And the process itself is strict. You have to weigh the child, convert that weight to kilograms, always. Then you check the established safe dose range for that specific drug.
Find the low and high end for that child's weight.
Precisely. Calculate the low and high safe dose, and then this is key. Verify the ordered dose falls squarely within that safe range. And always remember that critical safety check. The dose generally shouldn't exceed the minimum recommended adult dose, especially once a child gets over, say, 40 or 50 kilograms.
Got it. But it's not just math, is it? The delivery itself has to be developmentally tailored. Let's contrast, say, a toddler who's all about autonomy versus a school-age kid who's developing industry. How do we adapt?
Great comparison. So the toddler, right, they're asserting their independence. They need simple, non-negotiable choices. Do you want your medicine with the blue cup or the red cup?
Not if they'll take it, but how?
Exactly. You're giving control over the process, not the outcome. Never ask, will you take your medicine? Because the answer might be no. Now, contrast that with the school-age child. They're building that sense of industry, competence. They need to understand the why.
So explain the purpose.
Explain the purpose. Let them help if possible. Maybe put the pill in the cup. Reward systems can work well, too. It's about involving them and respecting their growing understanding.
Makes sense. Let's quickly touch on specific routes. Oral is common, obviously, but aspiration is a huge risk for kids under 5 or 6. What are the absolute must-dos for giving liquids?
Okay, first, never crush enteric-coated or time-release meds. Obvious, but worth repeating. Use calibrated devices, syringes, cups. Don't eyeball it. Administer the liquid slowly, like 0.2 to 0.5 milliliters at a time. Aim it toward the back, side of the cheek. Head elevated at least 45 degrees.
And that crucial teaching point about food.
Oh, absolutely critical. Never mix medication with essential foods, not formula, not their favorite baby food. If they associate that bad taste with something they need or love, you could create a long-term food refusal problem. Big no-no.
Such a practical point. What about eardrops? The otic technique seems simple, but it hinges on those little developmental differences.
It really does. First thing, temperature. The drops must be room temperature. Cold drops can cause pain, vertigo, even vomiting in kids.
Oof. Okay, room temp and the ear pull.
Yep, the pinna maneuver. It's totally age-dependent. For children younger than 3 years, you pull the pinna down and back.
Down and back for the little ones.
Right. And for older children, 3 and up, you pull the pinna up and back. It's a completely different manipulation based just on ear canal development. Easy to get wrong if you're not thinking about age.
Okay, good distinction. Moving on from meds, let's shift into section 2. Intravenous therapy. This is where fluid management becomes the really high-stakes game, isn't it?
Yeah.
Kids are just so much more vulnerable to fluid overload.
Incredibly high risk. Their small size means precise IV calculations are paramount. And their veins, well, they're smaller, more fragile.
Right. So site selection, hands, feet, forearms are preferred.
Generally, yes. You might see scalp veins used in neonates or infants. They lack valves, can sometimes be easier to access, but well, you need to prep parents carefully. Seeing an IV in their baby's scalp can be pretty frightening.
I can imagine. Is there a rule for choosing where on the limb?
Absolutely. The golden rule, regardless of age, is always choose the most distal site first. Start low on the arm or leg and work your way up if needed.
Got it. And use the smallest, shortest needle possible, like 21 to 25 gauge?
Typically, yes. Smallest gauge, shortest length to minimize trauma. Now, if we're talking long-term therapy or really concentrated or irritating solutions like TPN or chemo...
Then we need central access?
Exactly. A central venous access device. Could be a PICC line, peripherally inserted central catheter. Those can last for weeks or even months. Or other central lines like tunneled catheters or implanted ports.
Okay, let's nail down that fluid math. The standard 24-hour maintenance fluid calculation. It's based on weight, right? This is one nurses just have to know.
Have to know it cold. It's tiered based on weight.
Okay, let's walk through one. Say a 25-kilogram child. How do we figure out their 24-hour fluid needs?
Perfect example. So the formula is 100 milligram per kilogram for the first 10 kilograms of body weight.
Okay, 10 kilogram times 100 milli, that's 1,000 milli.
Right. Then it's 50 milligram for the next 10 kilograms.
So another 10 kilograms times 50 millirem, that's 500 millirem.
Correct. Our child is 25 kilograms, so we've accounted for 20 kilograms. That leaves 5 kilograms remaining. For the rest of the weight, it's 20 millirem per kilogram.
Okay, 5 kilograms times 20 millirem.
100 millilog.
Exactly. So you add those up, 1,000 plus 500 plus 100.
1,600 millirels over 24 hours. Then you divide by 24 to get the hourly rate. So 1,600 divided by 24 is about 66.7 milliliters per hour. Wow, the accuracy needed there is intense.
It really is no room for error. And just as important is monitoring output. For kids not toilet trained, you weigh the wet diaper. Remember, 1 gram of weight equals 1 milliliter of fluid output. And we expect about 1 to 2 millimole kilogram per hour for healthy urine output.
That's the target range, yes.
Now, site maintenance. This was interesting. There's been a big shift here compared to adults, hasn't there, about changing IV sites?
Huge shift, and a really positive one for kids. Historically, adult IVs were often changed on a fixed schedule, like every 72 or 96 hours. But for children, the current best practice is that ID sites should only be replaced when clinically indicated.
Meaning if there's a problem, like infiltration or phlebitis.
Exactly. If the site looks good, functions well, no signs of complications, you leave it alone. This minimizes the pain and trauma of repeated needle sticks. It's a huge win for atraumatic care.
Definitely. Okay, speaking of safety, particularly with central lines like PICCs, is there anything special about flushing them?
Yes, absolutely critical point. You must use a larger syringe, 5 millimiller, preferably 10 millimiller, for flushing PICCs and other central lines.
Why larger? That seems counterintuitive.
It's about physics, actually. A smaller syringe, like a 1 or 3 ml, generates much higher pressure when you push the plunger. That high pressure could potentially damage or even rupture the catheter.
Ah, okay. Lower pressure with a bigger barrel diameter. Makes sense.
Right. And briefly on the flush solution itself, saline versus heparin, there's always debate. The evidence often supports continuous low-dose heparin for maintaining central line patency.
But saline is often used.
Saline is often preferred because it's simpler, fewer incompatibility issues, less systemic effect. It's an ongoing clinical discussion, but the syringe size for flushing is non-negotiable.
Got it. Okay, final section. Let's dive into nutritional support. This covers both enteral feeding through a tube into the GI tract and parenteral feeding, which is IV nutrition. Enteral first. So NG tubes, OG tubes, gastrostomy tubes. Use when the gut works, but the child can't eat enough orally.
Exactly. Maybe due to failure to thrive, swallowing problems, high aspiration risk, things like that. If the gut works, use it. But the absolute #1 safety issue here is confirming tube placement. We have to be really emphatic about this.
Okay, what's the key takeaway?
Bedside auscultation, listening for that whoosh of air instilled into the stomach, is unreliable. It should never be used as the sole method to confirm placement.
So what is reliable?
The gold standard remains a radiograph, an X-ray, especially for high-risk patients or if bedside checks are inconclusive. Bedside methods should always include checking the pH of the aspirated fluid. Gastric fluid is acidic, typically pH less than 5. If you get a pH of 6 or higher, you need to stop and reassess. Don't feed.
Okay, X-ray, gold standard, pH check at bedside. And then for actually giving the feed, whether it's continuous or an intermittent bolus feed, we need to check the gastric residual.
Yes, check the residual volume, how much is still left in the stomach from the last feed before each bolus feed, and periodically during continuous feeds. And importantly, you usually replace whatever you aspirated. Don't just discard it unless the volume is excessive or looks abnormal because you're pulling out electrolytes and fluid.
Right. And positioning after the feed.
Specific positioning helps with gastric emptying and reduces reflux risk. Place the child on their right side with their head slightly elevated, maybe 30 degrees, for about an hour after feeding.
I like the developmental focus here too. For babies getting continuous feeds, why is using a pacifier during feeding time so important?
It's about maintaining that crucial link between sucking, feeding, and comfort. Even if they're not taking food by mouth, using a pacifier promotes the sucking reflex, exercises their jaw muscles, and reinforces that positive association with feeding time. It helps maintain normal oral development.
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Okay, switching gears to the most complex feeding. Total Parenteral Nutrition, TPN, this is the IV route, has to go through a central line because it's so concentrated, right?
Highly concentrated glucose, amino acids, lipids. Yeah, it absolutely requires central venous access. Peripheral veins just can't handle it. And TPN carries significant risks. Primarily infection, collab SI, central line-associated bloodstream infection is a huge concern.
So strict protocols.
Extremely strict. The TPN solution itself usually hangs for a maximum of 24 hours. It must be given via an infusion pump for precise rate control. You need specialized tubing with an inline filter. You start the infusion slowly, gradually increasing to the goal rate to prevent hyperglycemia, that sudden sugar load. And you have to monitor blood glucose levels frequently, maybe every 4 to 6 hours initially.
And that TPN line is sacred, basically.
Absolutely. You never administer any other medications, blood products, or any other IV solutions through the same lumen as the TPN. The risk of contamination and incompatibility is just way too high. Dedicated line.
What about kids who need to be mobile? I've heard of cyclic TPN. How does that work?
Right. Cyclic TPN is a great option for some kids. It means the TPN infuses over a shorter period, maybe 12 hours, often overnight, allowing them to be disconnected from the pump during the day for more normal activity.
But you can't just turn it on and off abruptly, right? Because of the high sugar content.
Exactly. That's the critical part. You have to taper the rate up at the beginning and taper it down at the end. A common practice is to run the TPN at half the prescribed rate for the first hour of the infusion, and again at half rate for the last hour.
To ease the body into and out of that high glucose load.
Precisely. It prevents those dangerous swings in blood sugar rebound hypoglycemia when you stop it suddenly, or severe hyperglycemia if you start it too fast. Tapering is key for safety with cyclic TPN.
Wow. Okay, that brings us to the end of a really dense but absolutely critical deep dive. We've covered those 3 pillars: adapting drug administration using pharmacokinetics, ensuring IV safety with precise calculations and site care, and mastering the very strict protocols for both enteral and TPN support.
Yeah, and looking back across all of it, what really stands out, I think, is how technical skill and developmental care are just. They're completely inseparable in pediatrics. Calculating that complex fluid rate is only half the battle. Every single procedure, every interaction demands that individualized, atraumatic approach, making sure the child's comfort and their trust are always prioritized.
It reminds me of that point in the source material.
Yeah.
An uncooperative child should never be labeled as bad.
Hmm.
So, given all the complexity we've discussed, the potential for error, how can nurses ensure the building trust through that consistent, honest, atraumatic care becomes the ultimate safety net? Especially when a child is resistant or scared. Maybe that trust is the most important guardrail we have. Something to think about.
A powerful thought to end on. It's all about that relationship.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into essential pediatric interventions. We'll catch you next time.